This is a very historic building. Having studied black history at the feet of Colin Powell and all the people that he marshaled for me in order to make me a better speechwriter for him when I first started to work for him, African Americans from all walks of life who had done things for African Americans in this country, to be standing here and read that plaque is quite a tribute. I mean, I didn't even know it was here, let alone the historic nature of this building. But we came here tonight to talk about something else, foreign policy. 2 weekends ago, I was on the University of Maryland campus. The title of the conference, which gathered academics from Dartmouth, Princeton, Harvard, Stanford, Chicago, and elsewhere, William and Mary, was The Rise of Populism and the Failure of Elites. An incredibly apt title for the circumstances the empire finds itself in today. For that is indeed what we have become since 1945, is the world's greatest standing and most expensive and most militarized, most national security state-like empire. Think in the past of such empires as the Athenian, the British, the Roman, you name your empire, and there are so many similarities to include physical irresponsibility unmatched that one wonders just how much longer this one will endure. When I talk to my students, I talk from the perspective of faithful decision-making. And we define that as decisions made by American presidents and their wholly owned subsidiary, the Congress, to send young men and young women to die for state purposes, either in covert or overt operations. And we study both. And something we forget as we define this term even more granularly, to kill others for those state purposes. For example, in the last 17 years, Brown University's Cost of War project, which I trust the figures of, like I do not trust the Pentagon's, say we have directly or indirectly, for the deaths suffered on 9/11, killed about 2 million people. And we have displaced into an already incredible refugee population of 65 million on the face of this earth today, more than 15 million. That's quite an achievement for an empire, I suppose, if you're Caligula, or you're Nero, or you're some other insane Roman emperor. But for a country that has existed on a myth this state has much to do with. One of the greatest spokespersons for what I'm going to talk about in detail tonight was James Madison. James Madison said the surest route to tyranny is the war power. And he went on in other places to say the war power in the hands exclusively of the executive branch of government, which is precisely what we have today. And I'm not going to excuse, as we didn't on the University of Maryland campus, either political party. Because whether it's Nancy Pelosi or Mitch McConnell, Chuck Schumer or John McCain, they're all guilty. They're all guilty in such enormous ways. I spent 3 weeks on the Hill on the war just briefly elaborated on, the brutal war in Yemen. Citing Title 50, U.S. Code, Chapter 33, Sections 1541 to 48, the War Powers Resolution, and Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution. Do you understand, Senator? I said in senator after senator's office, it's your responsibility to stop U.S. participation in this brutal conflict. A brutal conflict where we're supporting as our principal ally the greatest state sponsor of terrorism on the face of the earth because they own a lot of oil and have a lot of their money in U.S. banks. Do you realize that the rest of the world now, in poll after poll, thinks that the number one threat to their security is not their next door neighbor, India and Pakistan, for example, or Japan or China in South Korea. But 50% or more of these populations, to a tune of about 3 billion people in the world polled regularly, think the United States is the #1 threat to their security. This is a hell of an achievement. This is the achievement of empire. An empire that, if you examine the myth closely, has used the military instrument or the covert instrument resident in the CIA, an instrument Harry Truman never dreamed of creating when he stood up the CIA, incidentally, in more than 71 decided by the president killing operations. And I'm not even illuminating the covert that I don't know about, because the moratorium on their classification is not up yet. Ronald Reagan got caught in Iran-Contra, almost lost his presidency. Ronald Reagan's CIA director, Bill Casey, a Looney Tunes guy if ever there was one, conducted 58 covert operations, each one authorized by a presidential finding, each one with appropriated funds, and most of them failures. In fact, if you examine John Prodis's book, for example, Safe for Democracy, on covert operations, you will be very, very hard-pressed to find a success. You might say that overthrow of Mossadegh, the first elected prime minister of Iran in 1953, was a success. It got us the Shah for 26 years and stability in a very volatile region. You might say that the next year, the overthrow of Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala in 54 was okay, except we now know from all the papers that that was probably more to do with United Fruit and bananas. And the fact that half the Eisenhower administration, and I admire Dwight Eisenhower, so now you know how I don't admire the others, half his administration was virtually invested in some way in United Fruit Company. Even his executive secretary had shares. So why did we do Guatemala? We did Guatemala for capitalism. As Marine General Smedley Butler said, Al Capone operated in 2 states. I operated on 2 continents. And Smedley Butler was probably more truthful than any general officer from the Marine Corps, or any service for that matter, has ever been, about why the U.S. uses its military. But I understand that. As much as my 73-year-old body and brain today might not want to tolerate it any longer, for 31 years I was a part of that instrument. And I understood when we did things like that which was in the interest of our economic or security purposes. Today, we don't do that. Name me what we did the invasion of Iraq in 2003 for. My students, having done this over and over again in case study after case study, will go to the board at the end of the seminar and they will put on the board 8 or 9 motivations. Douglas Feith was a traitor, the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, and half of his team in the Pentagon were traitors. They were working for Israel. Flat out working for Israel. Their principal purpose was to reopen the oil line between Kirkuk and Israel. An oil line that was closed in 1948 after the war, causing Israel to have to pay enormous prices for energy. And Iraq never would renew that oil line. So that was their whole purpose. What was Dick Cheney's purpose? Dick Cheney's purpose was the purpose that I, as a lieutenant colonel in the 80s at U.S. Pacific Command, planned strategically for. A purpose I understood. It was to make sure not that ExxonMobil or Chevron or Total or any national oil company got their hands on Iraq's oil or Iran's oil or any other oil in the region. It was to ensure that oil flowed through the Strait of Hormuz in a consistent and constant way to our allies, and if we needed it, to ourselves, at a reasonable price. That was U.S. strategy all the way through George Herbert Walker Bush. What did we do in 2003? Dick Cheney said, I want that oil in Iraq because that oil surpasses Saudi Arabia's oil. And every day that goes by and the analysis comes in, looks like Dick was right. Iraq has more oil underground, even in its known reserves now, and probably in the Western Desert, twice that, than Saudi Arabia. So understand Dick Cheney's reason, while I might not understand why we did it at the time we did it and in the way we did it so incompetently. But when you examine what's happened since the end of the Cold War, you lose all this strategic rationale. And in part, what we examined at the University of Maryland was why? Why this failure of elites? Why academic elites at the University of Chicago, at Princeton, at Harvard, at Stanford? Why governmental elites in both political parties? Obama did Libya. A disaster. And you can say all day long that Hillary led him to it, that Susan Rice led him to it, that Samantha Power led him to it. That's no excuse for a president who sits in the Roosevelt Room on November the 10th, 2015, after 7 years in the presidency, looks me in the eye and says in a 45-minute disquisition, the opening sentence, there's a bias in this town towards war. And I want to fall off my chair. I want to get up and kiss him and say, a sitting president finally realizes what I've been teaching for 12 years. Good Lord. It took you a long time to figure it out. But then he went on in his disquisition with John Kerry sitting right beside him and said he had not a clue what to do about it. I wish I had more time to explain to him what he would have to do about it. You would have to get rid of, not a $720 billion budget. That's just the Defense Department. A $1.5 trillion budget. Because you can't talk about national security without talking about Veterans Administration, whose bill, I'm told by the sitting secretary right now, is going to be $80 billion a year for the next 20 years or more. Just to take care of the 4.5 veterans we created at this point. And we're creating them every day. And you've got to throw in the intelligence budget. Now, probably topping $100 billion if we really knew the secret money. And you've got to throw in State's 150 account. A pittance, to be sure, but you still got to throw it in. And you've got to throw in the nuclear account at Department of Energy. DOD doesn't have the nuclear weapons. VA is out. DOE has nuclear weapons. That's all to hide this from you, the taxpayer. They want to hide this from you. $1.5 trillion. It's not 3% of GDP. It's 7% of GDP. And when you put all that together and you look at Russia and China and the next 10 or 15 nations in line, combined, it dwarfs them. Why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? Because of the failure of these elites, governmental on both sides, corporate on every side, General Electric's vice president at the National Defense University. And Leon Firth and I are chastising him for having allowed stealth technology in a certain way to get to the Chinese. He looks right at Leon and he says, I don't have any responsibility other than to my shareholders. Leon said, you're a traitor. Well, I don't look at it that way. I'm a citizen of the world. Oh, really? Fine. The failure of corporate elites. Who made the mess that cost us billions of dollars at the end of the Bush administration? Corporate elites. Bankers especially. But don't excuse the Democrats that came before them, because Bob Rubin, the most powerful man in Clinton's administration, and Bill Clinton himself and Larry Summers were very complicit in that failure. By relaxing Glass-Steagall, the regulations FDR had set up and so forth, which had worked quite fine, thank you very much. And by allowing Summers and Anatoly Chubai to go to Moscow and to conduct a fire sale and increase Harvard's endowment from $5 billion to $20 billion almost overnight, they created a major enemy in Russia because they fleeced Yeltsin and they fleeced Russia. And they extended 2 middle fingers to them as they exited with the cash in their hands. So the Clinton administration set this up. Not only did it do that, its foreign policy elites failed miserably too. Look what they did. They expanded NATO to the extent that Moscow had a real reason now, a strategic reason, a geostrategic reason, to say, not only did you fleece me, but H.W. Bush promised me and promised my foreign minister, Edward Shevardnadze, that NATO would not go 1 inch further east so long as Russia accepted Germany's reconciliation and reunion and staying in NATO. What did Clinton do? Well, let's go to Poland. Let's go to Hungary. And George W. Bush comes along and goes to Tbilisi, Georgia, and says, you'll be a member of NATO in the future. And goes to Ukraine and says, you'll be a member too. And what does Putin do? Crimea, Ukraine. I'd have done the same thing had I been Putin. This is insanity. Failure after failure after failure in government, in corporate leadership, in corporate action, and in foreign policy. Now we have reaped the whirlwind. These people, the Clintons, the Obamas, the Bushes, they at least had what Michael J. Glennon from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts, who was with me at Maryland, has written in his book, The National Security State, Double Government. They were at least from that double government. They were at least from the people who knew the hell what they were doing. Even though we, and I suspect everyone in this room would, I know I would object to most of it, in our name and with our money. But they at least knew what they were doing. Now we have people who do not have a clue what they are doing, but they have an inclination to do the devil's work. As was said about John Bolton, I sat in John Bolton's office in 2002 along with the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific, Jim Kelly, and I said, John, I'm here from the Secretary, and Jim's here from the Secretary. We're here to tell you to stop your remarks about war on the Korean Peninsula. They're not helpful, they're making our job more difficult, and you're violative of White House policy. It is not George W. Bush's policy to have a war on the Korean Peninsula. I don't care. What? I don't do war. It's not my job. I know you do, because he knew both Jim and I had been in the military. Well, John, do you realize that in the first 30 days of that war, even the Pentagon predicts 100,000 casualties, of which probably 10 to 15,000 will be American citizens, because at that time, there were 150,000 Americans living in South Korea. There are now 230,000, along with 50,000 Japanese and 2 million Chinese living in South Korea. So it's not just the South Koreans who are going to die. Like Lindsey Graham said, don't worry, it'll be on the peninsula, Americans. Don't worry. Well, you know, how do you get that many Americans off? You don't. I can tell you, I've done the war planning for it. You don't, unless you start way early and you use civil aircraft. And if you do that, you're broadcasting war. So it's a win-no-win situation on the peninsula. So anyway, we're explaining all this to John, and he says again, I don't do war this year, bailiwick. John, all these dead people. Mox next to me. This is John Bolton. This is the guy who is now the third and latest National Security Advisor to a Looney Tunes president. And I don't use those terms unguardedly. I don't use them loosely. I think he's a psychopath. I think he's broke. I think he's so leveraged, and his whole family is so leveraged, that the reason he finally relented and took the presidency was because he saw it as a road to get unbroke for the first time in his adult life. And he's doing that at your expense, again, hand over foot. But he's got these people around him, and he doesn't get rid of them quite fast enough for me, that aren't interested in his enrichment, They're interested in their own intellectual pursuits, and John's pursuit is war. And we've been at war now for 26 years. Yeah. Not 16 or 17, 26. We were flying the northern and southern no-fly zones of Iraq with the British and the French, finally the British when the French fell off, in 2003 still. We were bombing Iraqis and they were shooting at our airplanes. That war never stopped. It started under H.W. Bush. So we've been at war for a quarter century and there's no stop in sight. None whatsoever. If elected, you will find out that we are, maybe, I don't know, they might not tell you. They won't tell a lot of people in the Congress. They only tell their buds in the Congress, like Steny Hoyer, like Chuck Schumer, like others I could name. They tell these things. We're flying across the borders of 9 countries right now with whom we are not at war and killing people. My son is a Reaper pilot. My son just spent a week with me on the Outer Banks. I took him there for one reason, because he's under such enormous pressure right now as a lieutenant colonel in running this operation that I detected post-traumatic stress in him. And that is one of the leading elements in the Air Force today producing post-traumatic stress is drone operators. Killing people 10,000 miles away is not too good for your psyche. That's what we're doing. On top of that, we're probably getting ready to kill some people, if they get in our way, in 3 more states. You don't know anything about it. You know, when the Congress says, what you doing in Niger? We're building a drone base so we can fly all over Africa. What are you doing in Mali? Well, it's one of the places next to Niger. What are you doing all over Africa is what Congress should ask. They don't want to know. They'd be really perplexed as to what to do if they knew, so ignorance is bliss in this case. Djibouti now, one Marine told me the other day, Djibouti, strategically positioned across from Aden, Yemen, right at the mouth of the Red Sea, has as many Chinese on it as Americans. And about 1/3 as much as both of those French. This Marine said to me, if we put another soldier or Marine in Djibouti, we'll sink it. And of course, the leader of Djibouti is playing Washington and Beijing and Paris off against one another, getting everything he possibly can from them. But this is unsustainable. Coming to Afghanistan, I listened this morning on NPR to a really good program so far as it went. They were interviewing former soldiers, Marines, who'd served in Afghanistan. 3 tours for one, 4 for another, soliciting any call-ins from any Afghan veterans that were out there and so forth. I listened to the woman and I listened to the man talk for about 15 minutes, and then I had to go somewhere else. I wanted to stop and listen to them more because they were summing it up really quite well, but they didn't see the big picture. And I wanted to scream into the radio, as I want to scream to every audience. I've been in all 50 states in the last 10 years. Audiences like this mostly. I'm preaching to the choir, but the choir is important, very important. I wanted to scream into that radio, soldier, soldier, Marine, you're right, but you're wrong. You're right about the Afghan people being a people to be respected, tribal leaders to be worked with. The ANA never given a chance, the National Army. The National Police never given a chance because the leaders of the U.S. forces over there, and to a certain extent NATO forces, constantly compromise, constantly are burnishing their own credentials and not really worried about the ANA and the ANP and about the Afghan people. That was their angst. I wanted to tell them, you don't even understand. Trump has turned Afghanistan over to the Pentagon. And the Pentagon is one of the few places, if not the only place in Washington, where anyone thinks strategically on a consistent basis. We're not in Afghanistan to state build. And we're not in Afghanistan to fight the Taliban, or Al-Qaeda, or ISIS, or any other terrorist group that might be resident there. Those are ancillary tasks that if they pop their ugly heads up, we'll act like we're doing something about them. We're there for 2 reasons. reasons, and the Pentagon has determined this, and we will not leave Afghanistan for 50 years. You heard it here. We're there first to check the Chinese Belt Road Initiative through Central Asia. As a military officer, planner, and strategist, I fully support that. But when are we going to tell the American people that's the reason we're there? That is the only place the United States has hard power, and it was extremely difficult logistically and otherwise getting there to check that initiative if it has to. And also to cover CIA operations in Xinjiang province in Western China, where there are 20 million Uyghurs who do not like the Han Chinese, and to get them into revolt, if we have to. The second reason we're there is to be close by the most unstable nuclear stockpile on the face of the earth, in Pakistan. They are building 10 new weapons a month. Delhi is going crazy, India, because they can't keep up. And why the Pakistanis are doing this is anybody's guess, but they are. At any moment, those weapons could fall in other than reliable hands. I'm not even sure saying the Pakistani hands, ISI and military, are reliable. And so we're there so we can move very swiftly and secure those weapons, or try to. When is the president, I don't even think Donald Trump knows this, but when is someone, Jim Mattis, anyone, going to tell the American people? Mattis and Votel both, Votel the Central Command commander, who's directly responsible for U.S. help of the Saudi-UAE coalition in Yemen, lied to the Congress a couple of weeks ago. And when we pointed this out, my stellar senator from Virginia, Tim Kaine, was nonplussed. He lied, he said, or he was unknowing, unwitting. I suspect probably he was unwitting, but that's just as bad if you'll think about it. He said there were no ground troops supporting the Saudi-UAE coalition. That's bullshit. Special forces are supporting them on the ground in Yemen. New York Times revealed it. So DOD had to sort of print a retraction. I saw Jim's letter to the Senate, and I saw his legal letter to the Senate about why we were helping the Saudis in Yemen. Both were absolute poppycock. DOD needs to read the War Powers Resolution. They need to read Title 50, Chapter 33. They need to read the U.S. Constitution. And these legal peccadillos like we did in my administration to justify torture, they just don't, they shouldn't rate with you. They shouldn't rate with any American of sober and sane thought. This is an incredible juncture we have come to in this country, in this empire. We either take it back or it's lost. Now, it may lose itself over the next 70 to 100 years. It may be inundated by the rising oceans and climate change in general as it sticks its storky head in the ground. But it isn't going to last that much longer in the eye of history. A century is chunk change in the pocketbook of history. It could go tomorrow. Let me paint a scenario for you that no one's looking at right now. The war in Yemen is ultimately going to be lost by Saudi Arabia and the UAE and the coalition behind them, including Egypt, which is really kind of crazy because Nasser's troops went into Yemen. Old-timers in Nasser's army essentially call Yemen their Vietnam. That's what's going to happen to Saudi Arabia because those rebels are never going to give up. They're going to retreat into the northern mountains and they're going to attrit the Saudis like the Saudis have never been attrited before, or the Saudis will quit. Either way, disaster that is drawn out or a quick disaster, Mohammed bin Salman is going to be blamed. The young boy king of Saudi Arabia, and he's going to be removed from office or assassinated. Saudi Arabia, the kingdom that can never go away because it's so rich it buys itself, its history, is going to disappear. And what are we going to do then? Move over to the other country that seems to have our fixed attention all the time and creates a traitor in America almost every year, or 2 or 3. Under Bibi Netanyahu, even more. Move over to that country, and its history is severely limited too, because they have elected a one-state solution. It will be increasingly an apartheid state, just as the West Bank is fully apartheid today. And it will last maybe 20 years, 30 at the outside, under the international opprobrium that it will create. And Israel will be no more. This is going to happen in my grandchildren and probably my children's lifetime, along with massive climate change, which right now, for example, is going to cost Norfolk and the Navy billions and billions of dollars just in the next 30 years to attenuate, let alone ameliorate and adapt and improve. Homeland Security told me the other day in a climate security working group meeting, they've got 14 political jurisdictions to deal with down there. They got 110,000 such jurisdictions to deal with across the country. Imagine their problem when they can't even get Yorktown, Chesapeake, Norfolk, and other municipalities to agree whether they want a 4-meter wall, an 8-meter wall, to relocate altogether. Imagine the frustration of the shipbuilders and the yards and the Navy when they can't get the civilians to make up their minds. And this is just one little microcosm of what's coming down the road. Langley, they can't take F-16s off for days on end because of 16 inches of water on the roadways. The last time they had rains in North Carolina, you probably remember, there was a picture on CNN of a guy fishing for catfish off his porch. The 82nd couldn't move for 3 days. That's our strategic reserve because of the flooding. It's going to get worse. It's going to get a lot worse. So we've got that challenge to meet too. And what is the current leadership doing about that challenge? Absolutely nothing except exacerbating it. But thank God, at least in this case, the military is moving out on all 4 cylinders, not 8, but 4, trying to do something about it. And being on 4 uses less, fossil fuel. They are at least trying to do something about it. In fact, I'd be less than honest if I didn't say that the number one bureaucracy in Washington dealing with climate change is the Pentagon. Because they understand it. When you look at Aceh in Indonesia, where 230,000 people died. I was in London, and the doyen of the ambassador corps in Washington calls me in London, and she gets me at the hotel. I'm supposed to be on leave for the first time in 4 years. I pick up the phone, and she's on the phone, and she says, I got to get Poland to come to Indonesia. I'd watched the TV that morning. I immediately knew what she's talking about. I said, Ambassador, I'll call. I called State Ops, got him on the phone, and he said, I got my ticket already. So he'd already figured it out too. He came back and he said, I've seen nuclear war, Larry. I've seen nuclear war. 65-foot fishing trawlers, 100 kilometers inshore, perched in trees. A 30-foot wave that moved in excess of 400 miles an hour and just devastated Aceh province, and totally in the other surrounding areas, mostly in Aceh and Indonesia, killed 230,000 people. This is the future for the military. And they were the first responders, as they almost always are. So they're looking at this prospect of having a 100-year flood, a 100-year typhoon, a 100-year earthquake, whatever, every 10 years now. What does that do to their disaster assistance and humanitarian relief budget? And they understand that. So that's why DOD is really seized of climate change and really angry with the Congress when they have people like Jim Inhofe say it's a hoax invented by the Chinese. I want to take that Oklahoma senator and just let me take you to Norfolk and stick you in the water. One lady in the theater in Norfolk, when I was talking about this issue, she stood up in the back and she said, don't tell me about 30 years from now, the water's in my backyard today. She's right. We just had to lift all the cables. Internet traffic, communications between aircraft carriers, destroyers, and so forth. We had to move them all because no one contemplated their being underwater, so it didn't make them watertight. That cost $22 million just to move them up, so they'd be out of the water for another 10 or 20 years at least. This is crazy. And now the failure of the elites is manifest because we got what that failure produced. we've got Donald J. Trump. And alongside him, the deadly dude, John Bolton. And some others, too. You saw one of them, Secretary of Homeland Security. I thought torture was as low as we could go in my lifetime. But when I watched that interview, and I listened to her, and I listened to those children, I thought, well, George W. Bush has been resurrected. He is now a good president by the standard that Donald Trump is setting. I don't think that's too far fetched. I think this president is a clear and present danger to the nation he is supposed to be leading. And I just hope and pray that his tendency to throw Flynn away, his tendency to throw McMaster away, anyone away at any moment who happens to not appeal to his narcissistic, arrogant nature will prevail with John Bolton eventually, because John Bolton is narcissistic and arrogant too. And so far he's been able to withstand a confrontation with the president or with Jim Mattis of any real size or power. And I don't see that lasting much longer, so my hope is that John will be ejected and we'll have a fourth national security advisor. God knows who that will be. Because someone told me the other day from White House personnel who's leaving herself, we cannot find anyone to work here. We cannot find anyone who wants to tie their wagon of whatever stripe that wagon might be to people like Steve Miller and Donald J. Trump. That's a hell of a statement, that you can't find people to work in what is usually the most coveted office structure in Washington. Even if you have to work 24/7, which you do on the NSC staff. I mean, you burn out after 2 years on the NSC staff. You're working 6 days a week, at least 16 hours a day, and sometimes on Sunday too. You can't stand that kind of pace, but people do it because they realize they're right next to power and they're helping that power be managed, however badly or well. But not here, not today. This is a tragic situation. And I'll finish by telling you what I tell every audience across this country, no matter what their stripe or political bid. It's our fault. We let this happen. Every single 330 million strong American let this happen. We let less than 1% of this country bleed and die for us in interminable wars. We let this guy get elected. We let the powers that be move after the end of the Cold War into an imperial stance unparalleled since Rome. We, the American people, failed in democracy. And I then say, if I were you, and I wish I were every single one of you in a collective consciousness where I could act in unity, I would fire every swinging one of those people in the United States Congress. Every one, none excepted. Then I would find people to elect who told me on the telephone, in an email, in a town hall meeting or something, that they were going to do A, B, C, and D, with which I agreed, number A of which would be stop this interminable war machine. Because that's what we are. Yeah. We live for war. Yeah. And if they didn't live up to it in 2 years or 6, throw them out too. The second thing I tell them is write op-eds, write letters to the editor. And most importantly of all, because I've seen this work dramatically, make constituent visits. When we were thinking about major U.S. ground forces in Syria, the constituent visits to the Congress ran off the chart. By that I mean, you go see Kane and Warner. You don't go see any other senator. You go see your senators. You go see your representative, or plural if you can get to them. I know they're by districts and you don't live in 2 districts, but you go see as many as... Go into their office and tell them, stop the war machine. Stop it. The White House told me they had over 200,000 separate communications. This is President Obama in that meeting I was talking about. John Kerry was kind of hanging his head because you may recall, November 2015, John Kerry was advocating as Secretary of State for ground forces in Syria. So President Obama was not just talking to me and General Eaton on my left. He was talking to his Secretary of State, too. That's why I'm not following your advice, John, was what he was saying. And do everything you possibly can do locally and in every mechanism you can do it in to fight this tendency, to stop this war machine. I read a story this morning. I don't know whether to rail at this guy or to kiss him. You may have seen it too. The Army just gave him a less than honorable discharge. He was in West Point. It's a long story. He applied from Pennsylvania, where he went to high school. He did not get accepted, even though he had his congressman's endorsement. He then enlisted, went to Afghanistan, served, obviously went to Ranger School too, which I went to, and I can tell you that's not the easiest thing in the world to do. Went to Afghanistan, served honorably, came home, saw that West Point was accepting enlisted people on a fairly consistent rate, applied again, got accepted, graduated from West Point, was commissioned as second lieutenant, got caught with videos. You know, the video camera gets everybody. His hat at graduation had, "The communists will win," written in it. He made some other comments about the empire and about how the empire is ruining the world and all this kind of stuff. And so the Army just fired him. They fired him. Now I'm sure he's worried, and his family, such as it is probably worried about his having to reimburse the military for West Point. Well, I'd get me a good lawyer. I wouldn't reimburse the military because the military kicked him out. He had no control over that. The military kicked him out and gave him less than an honorable discharge. I think it's the first time, I'd have to really research this, but I think I'm right in saying it's the first time a graduated commissioned officer from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point has ever been separated from service with less than an honorable discharge on such a specious set of circumstances. Speech, actually. Now, you do surrender certain of your constitutional privileges when you go into the military. But you also raise your hand, and I will never forget this, and you say, "I swear to support not the President of the United States, but the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and to obey the orders of the officers appointed over me," and so forth and so on. If you're following the Constitution and your president is violating the Constitution, I think you have a moral and ethical obligation to make some decisions for yourself. I'll close with this. There are a couple of people out there right now who are talking about, fairly eloquent people too, and when I was working a little bit with Bernie Sanders on foreign policy issues, I sensed this in Bernie. He lost it quickly. He lost it very quickly as soon as he got close to power and close to the Democratic Party. Democratic Party will burn it out of anybody if you let it happen. So will Republicans. Just so happens that my party is insane right now, and the Democrats look, in comparison, sober. They're both insane. First person I'd throw out is Pelosi. Second would be Feinstein, then McConnell, then Schumer. I'd throw them all out. They're worthless people. Steny Hoyer stepped in and stopped H-Con Res 81, which was moving its way through the House under the War Powers Resolution, and therefore enjoyed, and the parliamentarian assured us of this, enjoyed privileged status. Steny Hoyer stepped in, and with the help of Marv Thornberry and the House Armed Services Committee, representing all those defense contractors who make billions off this war complex, and Ed Royce on the House International Relations Committee stepped in, but they couldn't have done it without Steny, and they stopped it. We then moved to the Senate and got a 54-44 vote and scared the bejesus out of Mitch McConnell, because he thought at the last minute it might pass. That was a vote to table. So Senate Resolution 54 is still there. Both of these congressional actions simply invoke the Constitution of the United States against the president to stop him from making wars that Congress hasn't authorized. What a bunch of cowards. What a bunch of collective cowards. One senator had the gall to look at me and say, "We can't piss off Saudi Arabia." I said, "Why not? About time we did. And if we don't now, In the future, their collapse might drag us into the mire with them, just as Israel's collapse might drive us into the mire with them. I don't see that happening on my watch. How long do you plan to serve, Senator? Another senator. This is exact quote. Well, Yemen's a niche issue with me. The greatest humanitarian disaster since World War II. A niche issue? But she's right, because it is with her. It's a niche issue. Where is Yemen, after all? I'll bet you that half the Congress couldn't go to a map and point at Yemen. I know they couldn't go to a map and point at Niger. I tried it out. This is incredible. They're not interested. They are the wholly owned subsidiary of the war-making power, which is the executive branch. Final point, I promise. At the conference at University of Maryland, we had a panel of lawyers, really esteemed lawyers from all over, Chicago, Stanford, Harvard. And I asked a question, and I created the only outbreak of vitriol and anger when I asked it. Why is the third branch of government totally absent? Silence. One of the Harvard-trained lawyers says back to me, I think that's an irrelevant question. It's an irrelevant question that the President of the United States is violating regularly the Constitution of the United States, and the courts have nothing to say about it. I understand as an academic who has taught this for 15 years in the civilian world and 10 in the military world, that the courts have a deference to national security issues. They do not like national security issues. They feel like they're too political, so they don't want to get involved. But the Constitution is too political? Come on. You never weigh in. And then we had a discussion about Justice Scalia and how he used to come down to the Marine Corps War College, and the Marines loved him because he was the war-making justice. And I said, good God, he was supposed to be an originalist on the Constitution, and he never objected. Never. So it's all poppycock. The court is composed of people who are content and happy and fat and dumb, except in the law, and not in national security law. So we have a moribund branch of government, totally moribund. We have another one that's almost moribund because it's more interested in Kim Kardashian's ass than it is foreign policy or anything else of import, and that's the media. It's your turn. You're the only ones who can fix this. You and people like you all across this great country. It still is a great country. And you are what make it great. You're the only ones who can fix it. No one else can. No one else will. They're all a bunch of cowards. So we've got to take it back, ladies and gentlemen. We must take the state back and right it so that it can continue on the path that it started on in the first place, much impaired by slavery and other issues, but nonetheless on a pretty good track record. Today, we've deviated, and we've deviated majorly. And the only way to get it back and to right the state is you taking action. Thank you.